Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shashi Tharoor to this event. Shashi, would you please join me on stage? Shashi, this is your third or fourth visit to Australia, fifth visit to Australia. Now, what appeals to you about Australia, and also what has surprised you about Australia?
Well, actually, everything appeals to me about Australia. I mean, it's a gorgeous country. The sun shines a lot more than it does in many other places of the same kind of civilization, shall we say. And at the same time, you've got thriving, robust democracy. You speak a language we can understand. Occasionally, what surprised me is the fact that this is coinciding with your own internal debate about colonial legacy, about the statues, about the place of certain, shall we say, white notions of Australia in a society that's increasingly conscious of itself as multiracial and multiethnic. And that, I think, is fascinating. I mean, I remember the days, they weren't that long ago, when there was a white Australia policy, when racist politicians could openly say things like, two wrongs don't make a white, things like that. And where one saw Australia in many ways as rather set in a particular view of itself, which has changed dramatically in the last generation. And I remember how startling it was when Bill Hayden, as Foreign Minister, first started talking about some of these issues, describing Australia as an Asian country and so on. And the shock with which he was greeted within this country. You've come a long way, and that, I think, has been absolutely fascinating.
But just leading on from there, there are obviously parallels between the colonization of our two countries and the issue of writing of history is hotly debated here as well. What is it about this timing? Your books come out, you're finding the debate over here, there are things happening internationally. What's the background to this timing of it all?
Well, actually, my part in it is entirely coincidental. I mean, I happened to be invited to debate in the Oxford Union, in which I made a speech, like God knows, dozens of other speeches that others have made as well, but somehow this one captured the imagination of a global public that was mainly, I think, Indians and the Indian diaspora. When it went up on the internet, it was downloaded 3 million times in the first 24 hours. It was quite crazy. And I think from that onwards, I was pressed by my publisher to write a book because of the success of the speech. I mean, it's not very often that a speech is based on a book. It is often that a speech is based on a book. It's not very often that a book is based on a speech. But that's what happened in my case. But you're quite right that, curiously, there's a lot of other stuff happening at the same time. I have been making the point in the UK that it's shocking that you can do A-levels in history today without learning a line of colonial history. And I think it's important that we do that. I've also been pointing out to the consternation of some of my English interviewers that you have a city full of museums, most of which contain a lot of stolen goods from the colonies, but you don't have a museum to colonialism. There's an Imperial War Museum, but there is no Imperial Museum. And it's quite shocking that there isn't a place that school children or foreign tourists or whatever can go to see the history of the British engagement with the world whole. It's all brushed under the carpet. And it's replaced by these gauzy, romanticized soap opera type television shows, like Indian Summers and the Far Pavilions and so on, which honestly reflect a very, very distorted view of the reality and cut out the experience of the Indians who were colonized.
Dr. Tharoor, do you think that with Brexit coming along and obviously some challenges from there would make parts of this history even be more brushed under the carpet?
No, actually, paradoxically, the opposite happened. When Brexit happened, a bunch of English officials, some civil servants and some people close to the ruling Conservative Party, floated this bizarre notion that it didn't matter that Britain was leaving the EU because they would resurrect, as they called it, Empire 2.0. On top of which, the terms of trade that were available to Empire 1.0 would not be available to Empire 2.0. I mean, the East India Company came to India to make money. and they started trading. They didn't do that well. And then they realized it's far more profitable to trade at the point of a gun. Now, that kind of thing isn't available. Now you're dealing with sovereign equals. If you want a trade relationship with a country like India today, you're going to have to give as much as you want to take. And unless Britain's prepared to do some of that, and that too, you'll have to give them what they want, and you'll have to take what they're prepared to offer you, and that's the way negotiations work between sovereign equals. That's going to be very different from any notion of Empire 2.0. And I think they've scuttled that phrase fairly swiftly thereafter, but it went around for a few weeks was embarrassing enough.
The 100th anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. For a non-Indian guest here, can you give us a background to this horrific incident in our history, and why do you think that's the date where an apology is due?
In Amritsar, the second largest town in Punjab, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer showed up, and he swiftly declared what we call Section 144 of the Penal Code, which is forbidding the gathering of 5 people or more at any one place. What he didn't realize is it was the Punjabi Spring Festival of Baisakhi. And for Baisakhi, a large number of people congregating to celebrate, including a lot of people from surrounding villages, who were almost certainly completely unaware of Dyer's order. He heard, however, of large numbers of people in a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh. Didn't bother to find out there were mainly women and children. There were men, women and children gathered to celebrate one of the biggest festivals of the year. He arrived there, he didn't ask them what they were doing there, didn't order them to disperse, didn't issue any warning, didn't fire a warning shot. He just ordered his soldiers to fire directly into the bodies of the unarmed men, women and children, who then were wailing and stampeding out, except that the only gate, the only entrance and exit from Jallianwala Bagh is where he stationed his soldiers, as he explained, because that would make the people easier targets. And they fired 1,650 rounds that day. Not one bullet, Dyer boasted, was wasted. Every bullet hit a human being. 379 dead is what the British admitted to. The Indian claimed it was over 1,000. The truth lies somewhere in between. But in any case, 1,650 bullets hit human beings. And that wasn't even the end of the tragedy. Dyer barred the gates and forbade the relatives of the dead, the dying and the wounded to tend to their dear ones. So they were made to rot for 24 hours in the hot sun. Many died of inattention. And of course they had no water, nothing, they were just moaning and dying during this time. Dyer ordered Indians to crawl on their bellies on a lane nearby, and if they so much as lifted their head while they were crawling, they were bashed on their head with British staves. Now there's a lot more which I've described in greater detail in the book. But at the end of all of this, of course, there was an uproar. The House of Commons condemned Dyer. The House of Lords, however, quickly passed a resolution in his honour, praising him and wanting to support what he had done. A collection was raised by the British to reward Dyer for what he had done, and the sum in today's money of £250,000 sterling was raised and given to him with a bejewelled sword. And that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, hailed him as the man who saved India. So all of this put together, the betrayal of promises in the First World War, the brutality of the massacre, the racism and indifference to Indian suffering that followed, and then the self-justification and the reward, put together, seems to me, to make this the single worst atrocity of 200 years of British rule. And so what I've suggested is that if a member of the royal family, since everything was done in the name of the crown, if a member of the British royal family could come to Jallianwala Bagh, to Amritsar, on the 13th of April 2019, and ideally, as Willie Brandt did in the Polish Warsaw Ghetto, sink to their knees in apology and regret and remorse for what was done that day 100 years earlier, it seems to me would have a magnificently cleansing effect on these 200 years of imperial sins. Whether that will happen, many tell me it's extremely unlikely. A very senior Brit, whom I can't name because it was a private conversation, said to me, it won't happen because if we apologize to you lot, we'll have to apologize in 130 different countries.
Just coming back to the technology question which I was about to raise, you're one of the earliest adopters of social media among Indian politicians. But there isn't a lot of nuance left in the social media discourse. Is it still a valuable medium of communication for politicians?
Very much less so than when I started. I adopted Twitter when nobody else in Indian politics was doing it. And indeed, with very few public people were doing it. The result was that I incurred the enmity of a whole series of people. I incurred the enmity of the mainstream media, which was alarmed at the idea that a politician could go above their heads and go straight into the public. And so they spent a lot of time trying to hook up controversies in every single thing I've said in order to discredit me through my use of social media. But in the end, of course, I gave an interview in 2009 in which I said within 10 years every serious politician would be tweeting. It's an audience we'll have to reach out to, and I didn't need to wait 10 years. Within a few years, the opposition was quick to leap onto the advantages that social media offered, and they got onto Twitter and everything else. I remember a politician saying that Twitter doesn't even sound like a serious medium for a politician, to which I pointed out that Google and Yahoo are also pretty absurd words when you think about it, but they've become part of the normal discourse, and Twitter will one day, and indeed it has. Similarly, the way in which Facebook, for example, is pretty much obligatory for anybody. You may not have a page that people can befriend. I'm one of those who doesn't have that kind of thing. But I have a page that people can follow and like and so on. It's indispensable because there are 200 million people in my country, 200 million Indians on Facebook. So there's no question of ignoring that. Twitter has 28 million, but Twitter is now read by the very media that once spawned it. So anything you say on Twitter saves you the bother of calling a press conference. They'll make a news story out of it. And that's what's been happening as well. But the reason that Mr. Luthra is right that there isn't, in my view, the same degree of utility is that at the beginning of the social media experiment, you were interacting with real people. You said things that were genuine. Genuine members of the interested public asked you questions or came back with comments. You engaged in a dialogue or banter or whatever with them. Now there are so many organized armies on Twitter. Political parties have entire squads. The BJP has cells scattered throughout the country, and they give a marching order to a cell, and then 400 accounts tweet the same message against you. That's one phenomenon. The other is the troll phenomenon, where there is a lot of abusing taking place. That makes it deeply disagreeable for a politician like me, who has a point of view and is known for a point of view. Opening my timeline is very often a deeply distasteful experience because I get, 80% of the tweets addressed to me are abusive. And I really would have to have a lot of patience as well as a very thick skin to cut through them to find the ones worth actually engaging with and reacting to. So all of this makes it very much less useful than it should be.
We have just celebrated Onam, a festival that is celebrated across religions. Is there a message in it for today's religiously polarized times?
Onam, in the midst of time, was a Hindu religious festival commemorating the annual return to earth of an Asura king, Mahabali or Mahabali, who comes back to earth once a year to see how his subjects are getting along. Now that festival has become a festival owned equally by all communities. There is no sense amongst Christians or Muslims, about 25% each of the Kerala population are Christians and Muslims. There's no sense that they're celebrating something that originates in Hindu tradition. For them, it's their festival too. It's our Christmas. We give gifts, we give new clothes, we celebrate, we party, we eat a lot, we drink a lot, all that stuff. And that's something which happens in a spirit of all the communities sharing a moment of joy together. It's more than Christmas. It's like sort of like Christmas in New York, if you like. Maybe Sydney's become like that, but in other words, it's Christmas in all the secular sense of the term, devoid of the actual biblical origins of the celebration, and that's what Onam has become. Now, when Mr. Luthra asks me, does that have a lesson for the rest of India? Of course it does, because we are now living through a time where those who have come to power have unleashed a certain set of, shall we say, unpleasant forces that are felt empowered and liberated by the ascent of a Hindu chauvinist party to power, and that is therefore preaching a very sectarian view of what India is all about, that simply does not accord with the lived reality of India. So people like me are speaking out passionately against this and arguing that what we need to celebrate much more is the spirit of Onam, when everyone comes together, rather than the divisive Hindu chauvinism of the ruling class.
Pawan, thank you so much for that. That was a great discussion. I just want to pick up on this theme of history, grievance, reconciliation, the things that you've touched on. We know that history, as an Aboriginal person here in Australia, history is one of the big planks of our identity. It helps to forge it in a very positive way. It can also be a very negative thing. We're sort of brothers in arms, having written the essay this week that began this debate about statues here, and wondering about how do we reach a sense of reconciliation rather than a history that divides us and focuses on grievance. Amartya Sen, the economist and philosopher, says that identity fueled by an endless sense of grievance is what makes the world inflammable. And yet we have a need to be heard, for our histories to be validated and to be acknowledged. Where do we strike that line between acknowledging history and not being mired in an endless grievance and achieving reconciliation?
It's an impossible one to answer, because the only way in which you can reconcile the two is by actually finding common ground. It seemed to me, on a very superficial reading of the Australian press, that Australia is actually a good way along that road. Even the way in which Mr. Luthra began the evening, and the same thing happened at the Sydney Opera House this afternoon, at the Melbourne Writers' Festival yesterday, where people actually began by acknowledging the land, its ownership, its elders, etc., before moving into the discussion. Of course, there's a danger that can descend into tokenism or ritual devoid of meaning, but right now I get the sense it still has meaning, and it means a lot to people in Australia. And if the majority can acknowledge that there was a historic wrong done, it's obviously impossible to undo, but that there is a sort of moral case that needs to be acknowledged and atoned for, then you're well along the way to the ground that you're talking about. In other cases, that's less true. The French and the Algerians, or between the British and the Indians, maybe between the Portuguese and the Angolans. The Angolans are pretty much bought up most of Portugal now, so that's a bad example. Because they have the oil and Portugal doesn't, so half of Lisbon, I think, belongs to the Angolans. But by and large, the colonial relationship is one that both the colonized and the colonizer will need to acknowledge something of the other side of the story in order to find a common ground. And we aren't nearly there yet. So the answer is it'll vary from case to case and place to case. But in your case, I think you're all doing the right thing so far from what I can see.
Whether we like Mr. Modi or not, current Prime Minister, but it is very important that in any democracy, we need to have a strong government, but equally strong opposition. Now, unfortunately, the opposition in India has not been very relevant or very strong. As a result, the other side has its way everywhere. Now, in Congress party, which is the main opposition, there is obviously a problem with the leadership. Mr. Rahul Gandhi is not able to come up to that level to be able to counter Mr. Modi and his party. What is happening? Why the opposition, particularly INC, Congress, is not doing something to produce an effective opposition, which is very important for India?
I recognize this is a widespread perception. Obviously, as a loyal congressman, I don't share that perception, but recognizing that people believe it is indeed, for us, a difficult thing to do. And I know Rahul Gandhi. He is not the dumb guy who's caricatured in the media. He is not the deer caught in the headlights that come across in certain snippets on the news or on WhatsApp or whatever else. But you're right that once the brand has been tarnished in that way, it takes a long time to recover. I will say, though, that part of the answer is the one I already gave Mr. Luthra, that namely, as far as we're concerned, we're offering not one leader, but a collective and deep bench strength. Today, for example, the BJP had a cabinet reshuffle, and they appointed 9 new ministers, 4 of whom were ex-bureaucrats and not politicians at all. 2 of the 4 will actually have to be nominated to the Rajya Sabha in order to serve. So it's very clear that they feel they have no talent in their political ranks. And that's something which the country ought to be alarmed about, because a ruling party with a crushing majority that doesn't have enough talent to constitute a council of ministers is a rather dismaying prospect. Whereas, conversely, the opposition has a galaxy of talent available, including people who have served in various ministerial portfolios, who have stellar reputations, who can do a good job. And the challenge for us now is to say that that's a better alternative than a government where essentially everyone's a cipher and Mr. Modi calls all the shots.
Dr. Tharoor, when someone has the ability to look into the past with so much insight, to the extent that it makes our hearts race to an extent, I suspect you also have that ability to look into the future with a lot of clarity. So when you look back at the 190 years of British occupation of India, I suspect that what may come out as, for better or worse, their greatest achievement or the greatest calamity was the fact that they forged the place into one country. So looking forward over 30 to 50 years, when you have a country with more than 25% of its population, more than 300 million people who can't speak the language spoken in New Delhi, what do you see as the future of India as one federation with a very long-term view?
Yeah, I actually feel that India has actually grown more close and integrated over the years since the British left than the other sense. I think that there's more and more in common politically, culturally, and in every conceivable respect. Look at the extraordinary passions roused by the Indian cricket team, for example. I mean, it sounds trivial, but it's actually a reflection of a genuine sense of national identity and celebration. While the meaning of that team has deepened and widened, it used to be a team of elites from the cities, and now you've got small town people, even village players from different parts of the country, and they're all embraced everywhere as heroes. It suggests to me that the integration, the psychological integration of India is proceeding very well. You can now get masala doshas anywhere in Delhi, and you can get North Indian food in the south. In fact, chapati is supplanting rice in Kerala, to my utter horror. But this is happening, and salwar kameez has already overtaken the sari across South India. So you're seeing much, much more integration than you can possibly imagine. And living in India as we do, even the question of whether India may survive as one seems completely absurd, because there is no real threat. There was recently an unnecessary kerfuffle caused by the BJP trying to talk about Hindi being the national language, but it's not. It is the official language alongside English, but it is not the national language. And the South promptly sort of reacted adversely to it, and there were some silly chaps on Twitter who talked about setting up a rival Dravidistan to oppose Hindi hegemony. But very quickly, of course, that died down, and most people have no desire to undo the great advantages that India as one country represents. A larger playing field for everybody, a larger common market, a stronger economy, a stronger military, all of that. So I don't think that's really under threat at all. Kashmir may be a potential problem, but everywhere else integration is growing. In fact, the issue with the Northeast, which at one time was trying to secede, is Northeasterners clamoring for greater acceptance and objecting to the racism with which many of them are treated in places in Delhi. And I think the consciousness of that means that the integration of the Northeast into the Indian mainstream imagination is going to be very much more advanced in the years to come. I see only positives in that direction.
But do you find it easier to make the comments and deliver the important messages you do? Is it easier to do that as a politician than it was a diplomat? You could have been United Nations General Secretary if you hadn't perhaps been so much your own person, in the same way that you could be Indian Prime Minister, perhaps if you weren't so much your own person. But I commend you on being your own person. But in which forum, as a diplomat or as a politician, do you find it easier to deliver the important messages that you do deliver? And to that extent, it may be also picking up on the earlier question, how do you cope with the change?
You're right that obviously politics gives you a little more freedom to be outspoken, because in politics you are able to stake out your own positions and defend them and win votes or not on the basis of that. So to that degree, yes, I found politics relatively liberating. As a UN official, I constantly had to ask myself whether something I said would be offensive to a member state, which would obviously be in violation of my obligations as an international civil servant. I speak from a certain very clear set of yardsticks as to what is right, what is moral, what is advantageous to the country, and what needs to be spoken for and defended. And that's not a comfortable place to be in any profession, but certainly in Indian politics too. I get my share of critics on both sides. There's a wonderful old story about a British member of Parliament many, many decades ago, who in his maiden speech referred to the other side as his enemies, whereupon a member from the other side stood up and said, "Sir, we are not your enemies, we are your adversaries. Your enemies are sitting behind you." And to some degree there is that in Indian politics as well. So all I can say is I will continue speaking for what I believe in. Those are, at the end of the day, personal views. I will never tailor my words to the convenience of my party, but I will sometimes observe silences in the interests of my party. In other words, there will be times when I don't speak my mind, simply because it goes against what my party wants to see done or support. But when it's a question of expressing a view, I will always speak what I see as the right thing and as the truth. And that, I'm afraid, Jonathan, as perhaps you find in Australian politics as well, is not always the most politic thing to do, but it gives you the clearest conscience when you go to bed at night. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Shashi.